everyone, welcome to the October 3rd edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Milkowski, and we are looking back at last week's stakes action from around the country. We're going to start by focusing on Santa Anita, where they did run some Breeders' Cup prep races on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. The Grade 1 action did take place Saturday, where the feature race was the Awesome Again. Craig and I did some handicapping of that card on the TimeformUS forecast last week, so we'll recap some of those stakes races that we previewed and the results of them. Also take a look at the Chillingworth from Friday, as well as the stakes that they ran on their Sunday card, prep for the Breeders' Cup Distaff, as well as the Turf, though we'll see how many actual Breeders' Cup contenders do come out of those races. We'll move on to Belmont at the Big A. Aqueduct this past week, unfortunately, only got 2 days of racing in there, as the weather situation in the New York City area was not too kind to outdoor sports, so they did have to move that Saturday card to Sunday. We're able to run most of the races, although the Turf Classic, which was originally scheduled, that's going to be rerun next week, so not quite the slew of Breeders' Cup preps that we were hoping to get in at Aqueduct this week. We'll talk about the races that were run, and then we'll close things out at Churchill Downs, where they had some stakes action on Saturday, topped by the Grade 2 Lucas Classic. We'll talk about that race, as well as the Ack and a big performance by a 3-year-old turf horse that we'll get to towards the end of the show. But Craig, the bulk of the stakes action that I think will have Breeders' Cup implications did take place out west at Santa Anita, and I think we saw some nice performances.
We did. We saw decent performances, I would say. Speed figure wise, it's a little bit disappointing for me. This is usually a week where we get some really nice speed figures from top horses, but we've talked about it before. A lot of top contenders are skipping these races, so we didn't really get anyone step up and deliver what I would consider really top class Grade 1 speed figures, but there were some good efforts and some good betting races from our perspective, so happy to talk about them, but still just a little disappointing numerically.
Yeah, and I think it really depends on the division, how much of an impact some of these races are going to have on the Breeders' Cup in about 5 weeks' time. Obviously, the turf divisions are expected to be dominated by some European invaders that we typically get coming over, so I think you have to just proceed with caution if you are liking any performances of some horses that participated in those turf prep races. I think we did see some nice efforts among the dirt horses, particularly the dirt sprinters and milers. I think we could see some of those races producing contenders for races like the Breeders' Cup Sprint and Dirt Mile, but we'll talk about those as we go through. Let's start off, Craig, by talking about the Grade 1 race from last week at Santa Anita. That was the Awesome Again. Race 8 on Saturday, this one going the 9 furlongs, of course, for the older runners, and nice to see Slow Down Andy get that Grade 1 victory. He's a horse that has been sort of an overachiever for a long time, a California bred that has spent much of his career racing against open company. He's been versatile, he's won graded stakes on the turf, has won going short and long, and just nice to see him get this Grade 1.
Yeah, I was happy to see him win. I know we were both fans of his for this particular race, and he delivered, and he did it just like the TimeformUS Pace Projector said he would, going right to the front, which I don't think was easy to predict just looking at the PPs. He wasn't really a true front runner, but good ride by Mario Gutierrez, just put him on the front end. The fractions were honest. They weren't fast or slow, just solid, and he was out there by himself, and when they turned for home, the race was basically over. He wound up with a 122 TimeformUS speed figure, so a decent effort, not quite as good as even he ran when he was third last time in the Pacific Classic behind two very good 3-year-olds, but he's just a good, solid, hard-knocking horse.
Yeah, he really never looked like a loser of this race when you were watching it, especially once he got to that clear lead. There was some unexpected rain that fell at Santa Anita on Saturday, which did prompt them to take 3 races off the turf. Not the 2 stakes races that closed out the card, which we'll talk about, but I think we do have to note that most of these races on Saturday on the dirt were run over a track that was labeled wet fast, and watching a lot of those races, I know there was a narrative out there that it was a speed favoring track. I don't know if it was more or less speed favoring than Santa Anita usually is, but it definitely helped to have forward position in these races, and that certainly suited Slow Down Andy. And when you get one of these situations where there's no confirmed front runner and you get a horse with finishing ability out there on the front end, he's just really tough to pass. And personally, Craig, I didn't see major excuses for anybody in behind him, certainly not for Defunded, who just seems like he's lost some of the early speed that he possessed from the first part of the season when he was having so much more success. I guess Senor Buscador deserves a mention for closing into what was a moderate pace, but I don't know where he's really going, because he feels like a horse that, unless they turn him back to the dirt mile, where he might get some more pace, the Breeders' Cup Classic, which I think is where they're pointing Senor Buscador, just feels like a really heavy lift for a horse like this.
Yeah, it does. I mean, he basically ran his race speed figure wise right around the 120 mark. He got a 118 this time, and you could basically say the same for the top five finishers. They all showed up and ran their race. They just ran into a better horse, and I'm not sure what the plans are for Slow Down Andy. I would hope it's Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile, because, I mean, we already saw he probably can't handle the top two that he lost to in the Pacific Classic. Even though, I mean, he didn't run bad in defeat, but I don't see any reason to think he would turn the tables. And the distance is a question, too. Even this 1.125 I wasn't sure was in his wheelhouse. I think the mile would fit a lot better than the Classic.
Yeah, he probably has a better chance in the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile, but the connections did say after this race they have no interest in the Dirt Mile. They ran in it last year. He's going to the Breeders' Cup Classic. And, Craig, I've got to say, I don't blame them. I think if there's a year that you're going to take a shot in the Breeders' Cup Classic, it is this year. There are no flight lines out there. There's no clear-cut favorite. It's very wide open. It kind of feels like the 3-year-olds have the edge this year coming into it. Arcangelo, arguably the early favorite for that race, and Arabian Night, the horses coming out of the Pacific Classic, like you mentioned, obviously major contenders, but it's a pretty wide open classic field, so I can't blame them for taking a shot, even if they're going to be a big price in that race.
Oh, no, I can't either. I mean, don't get me wrong. I want horses to take shots. I'm just thinking as how usually connections do is they're looking for the easiest spot to get the win. So I'm glad to hear that he's actually going. It surprises me. And I mean, you never know. Like I said, it's not like he was embarrassed in the Pacific Classic. He ran great, really. I'm not sure he's a real contender, but that's fine. It's not like favorites win every race. We've seen plenty of upsets, even on the biggest stage. So why not give him a shot?
Another race that was run on Saturday that could have some real implications on the Breeders' Cup is the Santa Anita Sprint Championship. This one, the Grade 2 event, going 6 furlongs, obviously the prep for the Breeders' Cup Sprint. And, Craig, this was a race that we talked about last week. Didn't seem like there was a ton of speed on paper. I'm still surprised at who ended up on the lead. I don't think either of us predicted that Sir Atticus would be out there without too much pressure, and that none of the Bob Baffert trio would be ridden that aggressively. I think that was the biggest surprise in the race, and I think that might have worked against a couple of them. I mean, Speedboat Beach, he ran his race in a nice effort coming off the long layoff, but it just allowed Dr. Scheibel to work his way into the race gradually up the inside, and we know something about Dr. Scheibel. If he's in the mix at the 8th pole, he's going to really fight for it. He's a horse that likes to be in a dogfight to the wire, and he was able to get his head down in front of Speedboat Beach at the finish line. Nice efforts from both of these horses, and I think that each of them, you could argue, are legitimate contenders going into the Breeders' Cup Sprint.
Yeah, I would agree with that. They actually only get 117 TimeformUS speed figures, but if you look at the final time, it was a 125 for both of the two. It was just the pace was so slow early on, and you might look at the fractions and say, how could that be slow when it's a near 22 flat and 44 at 0.27? But that track was very, very fast. The final time of 108.49 kind of tips that off. And it was a good race, but I do think these two had things their own way when you consider the long shot in the field who set the pace. Only dropped back to 4th. I don't think he was a horse many people were given much of a chance. So I think they're both very good, but I think there are some questions of how they would handle a faster pace. And I don't want to totally dismiss Fort Bragg. I know we had some questions about whether he could turn back to 6 furlongs, but given how slow the pace was, I don't think he ran terrible, and is a horse who's more than likely maybe he wants to come off of it. I know that's still kind of iffy at this point, but I'd like to see him drop back a little further in a race with a fast pace.
Yeah, I think they rode Fort Bragg the way that they had to in this race. You didn't want to drop too far back, just given the way the track was playing, and especially given the expected pace situation in here. So they tried to keep him a little closer, and maybe that took away from his finish slightly, but he still ran pretty well to at least pass a horse in the stretch to be 3rd in this race. Speedboat Beach, Craig, I wonder if he would have won this race if they just gone on with it a little bit more in the opening quarter, because Victor Espinoza was sort of leaning back in the stirrups. I mean, he had horse and just was trying to rate him along, maybe coming off off the layoff was playing into their strategy a little bit, not trying to do too much too soon with him. But he ran really well for his first dirt start since the summer of his 2-year-old season. This is clearly a horse that has a ton of natural ability. Something kept him off the racetrack for a very long time, but if they can get him back into a productive rhythm, he's a horse that I think you have to take very seriously in the Breeders' Cup.
Yeah, I agree. Of the two, I would prefer him. I think he's really dangerous second off the layoff, assuming he's going to the Breeders' Cup Sprint. And a little puzzling with the tactics, given how it wasn't the other Bob Baffert horses. I mean, Arabian Lion, who I thought might take the lead, was basically terrible. He never showed up at all in this spot. So a little perplexing that Speedboat Beach was just kind of content to sit off the long shot instead of going. But I'm with you. I think he's going to be very dangerous next out.
Yeah, I don't know what was going on with Arabian Lion. He was a little chilly on the tote board to be third choice in this race. And, I mean, he came out of the gate and the jockey showed absolutely no intention to get him forward. He just kind of rode him like they knew he was getting nothing. So I don't know what was going on with him, but a disappointing performance for sure. And it would be surprising if he goes on to the Breeders' Cup after that. Let's move on to some of the turf stakes that they ran later in the day on Saturday. The Grade 2 City of Hope Mile was won by the favorite Hong Kong Harry, and no big surprise here, Craig. He was just the class horse coming into this race, and he also got an absolutely perfect ride and trip from Juan Hernandez, just saving ground every step of the way, tipping out at the top of the stretch, and having to work a little harder than you might have expected to run down Astronomer, but that horse was pretty game in defeat.
He was, if on the forecast, he was my top pick in the race, and I thought I had a little something there. Well, I did wind up with a little something, but not what it could have been if he had won. But basically, this race came down to the only three horses we really even considered in the race. Hong Kong Harry, Astronomy, and Whist were the top three across the wire. Hong Kong Harry ran that 123 Timeform US speed figure, which is right up there with the best races we've seen from him in the past, and which was always going to be good enough to beat this field if he produced it. So good effort from particularly the runner-up. Twist ran fine, but Hong Kong Harry just a little bit better horse. I don't know if I think I saw he wasn't being pointed to the Breeders' Cup, which maybe that's a wise decision given that his speed figures aren't really that high, but who knows in a race like the Breeders' Cup Mile, especially at Santa Anita, trips are going to play a big part. He's a good horse, so it'll be interesting to me where he turns up.
Yeah, I think the Breeders' Cup Mile, if that's where they would, in theory, point a horse like this if they were ambitious, that's just a really tough race for an American horse to win these days, especially one based in Southern California with the European contingent that usually comes over for that race. So, I'm not going to blame anybody for skipping the Breeders' Cup, even if they have a horse that's in good form. I want to give him credit because the pace was slow. Most of the fractions color-coded in blue here, so that certainly favored the front runner. But, he was right in behind that horse most of the way. He was in good position and, was just able to run him down. So, nice effort from these horses, but feels like there might be some better Americans out there. And the Eddie D was the prep for the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint that was run a little bit earlier, though this one going 6.5 furlongs, whereas the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint will be a 5 furlong event this year. And this also was a race that was moved from the downhill course onto the flat chute 6.5 furlong turf configuration. So make of that what you will. And Craig, I think it is worth noting the distance for the top two finishers because both Lane Way and Brand just feel like horses that are better going a little bit longer. So we'll see if turning back to 5 furlongs in the Breeders' Cup really suits them. I thought that Lane Way got a perfect trip to win this race. Again, this was a turf race where the pace wasn't that fast, and he was just sitting in behind the leader on the rail the entire way and got out with plenty of time to make his move. Bran also got a good trip, had to wait for some room in upper stretch, and maybe it could have been a little bit closer if he had gotten out sooner, but they both ran well.
Yeah, they ran fine, and we should mention this was a race that did come off the hill course. I think maybe you did mention that now that I think about it. Just on the regular 6.5, but I agree with you. I'm not sure that these are really 5 furlong horses. I did want to note that even though this was a course labeled as good because of all the rain that they had on Saturday, it was still a really fast course. So I don't want to put too much stock into that. I would consider this a firm turf course, but Yeah, these horses, it's hard to imagine them really wanting to go the 5 furlongs, but it just kind of depends how hot things get up on the front end. Sometimes they go crazy in those 5 furlong races, and horses are able to come from well off of it. I think if both of these two were to show up, they would be pretty far back in the field early.
Yeah, frustrating beat for me with Noble Reflection, who I could not believe was a size 15-1 in this race, and really had everything his own way, and at the end of the day just wasn't quite good enough, but ran a game race to only be beaten half a length. It's just the trouble with horses like that, Craig, is it feels like this was the time you wanted to have him, and it just didn't work out. 5 furlongs in the Breeders' Cup. Well, first of all, I doubt they even get into that race given his resume, and it just feels like shorter probably isn't better for a horse like that as well. Let's move on to the Grade 2 Zenyatta. This is one of a few stakes races that they ran on Sunday at Santa Anita. And Craig, just more of the same in this division in California, with Adair Manor just dominating whoever is willing to show up against her. And lately, that hasn't been too many horses. She was 1-9 and basically won like she should have been.
I mean, I was a little when I watched the race thinking maybe she took a big step forward and could be a contender for a race like the Breeders' Cup, but I don't have the official speed figure yet, but I'm guessing it's going to be right around the 117 mark, nothing too exciting. So, yeah, it's hard for me to take her seriously as a contender for the Breeders' Cup if that's where she's pointing. It just seems like she's beating up on the same horses who are just okay. I mean, we've seen Desert Dawn. Feels like she's run a million times in her career already, and she always shows up and runs a good race, but she's just not a grade one horse, and neither are any of these in the field, really.
No, I mean, Adair Manor was winning her 5th race in a row, her 4th graded stakes in a row, and I mean, she's been doing it as the odds-on favorite every single time. I mean, really, the best horse that she's beaten this year is Kirsten Bosch, who we'll talk about in a little bit, but I mean, I don't think anybody views her as one of the best fillies or mares in the country, so, I mean, she's just sort of been isolated out west in this division, and I guess they are going to take a shot in the Breeders' Cup this year, given that it's out in California, but yeah, it's going to be a real test for her, and I'll be somewhat skeptical for sure that she's going to be able to translate that form, because not only is she not beating the toughest competition, but she's been getting some pretty favorable pace setups in a lot of these races, and that was certainly the case on Sunday at Santa Anita. So we'll see when she faces some of the heavy hitters in this division if she can be as effective, but could be a tough assignment for her if she goes on to the Breeders' Cup next. Also on Sunday was the Grade 2 John Henry Turf Championship, this one going 1.25 miles on the turf. I guess maybe a prep for the Breeders' Cup turf, though it feels like this division doesn't usually produce too many serious contenders for those, at least extended Breeders' Cup turf races. This one, Craig, just dominated on the front end by Balladeer, who opened up on this field early, and I've got to say, I really liked this ride from Victor Espinoza because he didn't leave anything to chance. He made sure that he had built up an advantage in the early stages of this race, and once it turned into a sprint to the wire, a lot of the major contenders just were too far out of contention.
Yeah, I like the ride by Victor Espinoza. He's a horse who's just getting better every single time out. He's just a 4-year-old. He keeps improving. He ran that huge speed figure at Kentucky Downs last time, a 123. We've talked about it a lot. Those are always a little suspect when horses ship around and go back to more normal American courses, but Balladeer was able to transfer that form fine. He's another, I don't have the official speed figure, but I'm guessing he ran another about 120, low 120s type speed figure. So good effort by him. Same as we've been saying, don't really think he's a Breeders' Cup type horse, particularly going 1.5 miles. It seems like that would really be stretching it for him. But he's a horse who, if he stays out in California, he's going to win a lot of races with this kind of speed.
Yeah, the big no-show in this race, obviously, was Gold Phoenix, who can be sort of an up-and-down horse. I mean, when he's good, he's pretty good, and he's able to win multiple graded stakes out in Southern California, but he does throw in clunkers from time to time, and that was the case here. The pace obviously worked against him, and you could see at the top of the stretch, Juan Hernandez tipped him out and basically wrapped up on him immediately because he realized, I'm not getting anything today. I just am way too far back, and they're sprinting up front. So not a great result for that horse, but I think it would have been a struggle for him to participate in the Breeders' Cup anyway. They took a shot in the turf last year; it wasn't successful, so probably better that they set their sights on some less lofty goals later in the season. Also on Sunday was the Grade 3 Tokyo City. This one, a mile and a half on the dirt, so not a prep for a Breeders' Cup race, but they do run that Thoroughbred Aftercare Alliance Stakes on Breeders' Cup weekend, I think going a mile and 5/8. So I guess this is a prep for that. And the winner here, Craig, missed the cut. A nice horse who's capable of running on both dirt and the turf. They've obviously brought him to Southern California trying to make him into a dirt horse, and maybe the added distance was just what he really needed to shine.
Yeah, he looked good. I mean, he obviously dusted this field, winning by over 5 lengths. He's going to get about a 116 speed figure, I would say, so nothing too exciting on that front. The problem with this division is if you go for the big race on Breeders' Cup weekend, you're going to run into Next, and good luck beating that one with the form he's in. But he did certainly appreciate the added distance, so I wouldn't blame him for taking a shot.
Yeah, he was visually impressive. I mean, he got a great trip, just basically stalking in behind some speeds with cover, and then, well, speeds in quotation marks, they were going pretty slowly up front, but, I mean, once he tipped out at the top of the stretch, he did show some acceleration to finish off this race, but like you said, it's a pretty tall order to beat Next in the form that he's in right now, and it sounds like his connections are pointing to that Thoroughbred Aftercare Alliance, so he's going to be a heavy favorite, justifiably so, and miss the cut. Maybe one of the few new shooters that you can consider who hasn't tried Next yet, but it's going to be a heavy lift to beat him. And we'll close out the action from Southern California this past week by going back to Friday, the opening day of that Santa Anita fall meet, and the Grade 3 Chillingworth, I guess, was supposed to be the final Breeders' Cup prep for Ida, and maybe bring her into the Breeders' Cup with a pretty formidable win streak, but she finally went down to defeat Craig for the first time in, I think, like 2 years or something. I think she's a horse, and we talked about it in the past, that was developing a reputation for winning races, but really hadn't been running the fastest speed figures. And, we were just waiting for the time that maybe it was going to be the right circumstance to take a shot against her. And turned out Friday was the day, as a fast pace kind of got her run off her feet a little bit, but she wasn't even able to catch the speed, and it all set it up for Kirsten Bosch to come from off the pace. And she's never going to break any stopwatches, but she's a reliable horse who shows up and has a lot of distance versatility, and was able to close this field down.
Yeah, the betting was kind of crazy in here. I mean, I guess it's to be expected with a string of wins like Ida had, but she hadn't really run any faster than 3 or 4 others in here. And this wasn't a particularly fast race either. Kirsten Bosch gets a 112 TimeformUS speed figure. So even for Grade 3 fillies and mares, I would say that's probably a little bit below par. So not the strongest group. The pace was a little on the quick side, so I guess you could give a little excuse for Ida, but it's not like she was on the pace. The horse clearly unhinged, who finished second, was right up there and was able to fend her off. So Ida actually ran the same speed figure she always runs, a 112. She just finally ran into some horses who were of the same ability.
Yeah, and I do want to give an upgrade to Clearly Unhinged, because she was the one that was contesting that fast pace, put away the other speeds, and held on pretty well for second here, holding off Ida, who arguably got a better trip than she did. And Clearly Unhinged was the 3-year-old in here. It was facing some older rivals, so, I mean, I think she deserves some credit for this performance. It's just, this is another really tough division when you've got horses out there like Goodnight Olive. We'll see which race Echo Zulu ends up pointing for, the Breeders' Cup filly and mare sprint or the sprint. But I mean, even with others that are waiting in the wings, like Society or some others we'll talk about later in this podcast, it feels like a tough division for a horse coming out of Southern California.
Yeah, it does. And if there's the one I would want, it would be Clearly Unhinged. She actually got the highest speed figure in here at 116. Is the 3-year-old with some upside, but like you mentioned, it's a extremely tough division this year.
Well, let's move on to New York, where we just got in that one day of stakes racing this past week. We're planning to run even more stakes races on Friday, which was canceled, and then the original Sunday card, which will now be moved to Wednesday. They were planning to run some 2-year-old stakes races that day, but we did get in this originally scheduled Saturday card on Sunday, just unfortunately without the Turf Classic. I mean, there was so many inches of rain that fell in the New York City area. Just running on the turf would not have been advisable. Hopefully we get a better forecast for the upcoming weeks and we're able to get in those turf stakes races, but it's just been a crazy situation with the amount of rainfall, really going back several months in New York. But as for the races they did run on Sunday, Craig, the feature, I guess, was the Grade 2 Woodward. I think it's the first year that it's been running as a Grade 2 event, just downgraded from its long-time Grade 1 status. But we did see a horse with plenty of Grade 1 credentials win this race in Zandon. I mean, he was the class coming in here, and he finally got back to the winner's circle. Really a horse that had been in good form for a long time, and I wouldn't say that he was a horse that has hanging him so much as he just kept finding rivals that were a little better than him. And in this race, that wasn't the case, and he was able to assert his superiority.
Yeah, he went off even money for a reason. He was the horse who had run consistently faster than everyone else. And he did it here again, too. And he looked very good doing it, I'll admit. I mean, he won by over 4 lengths. The pace was solid. I think one of the fractions is coded in red in the race. Wasn't the strongest field in the world, but I thought he ran fine and he did exactly what he was supposed to do. He wound up with a 124 TimeformUS speed figure, which fits right with his other 3 races this year. He just didn't run into any horses in super top form this time that were able to beat him. So I would hope that he shows up in the Breeders' Cup Classic because I think he's actually pretty good. I think I saw Chad Brown say it was a maybe at this point, but I think he deserves the shot.
Yeah, I think he's a horse that definitely has to be at the Breeders' Cup Classic. I mean, who is there to be afraid of? I mean, Zandon is running speed figures that, I mean, aside from that big number that was run by White Abario in the Whitney, where Zandon obviously lost to that horse by 6 lengths, I mean, Zandon's speed figures, they're right there with everybody else. It's not like the 3-year-olds are running that much faster than their older rivals. They're basically right in line. And I think you give the 3-year-olds the edge because you do project them to have even more improvement in the latter half of the season. But Zandon is a major player going into that race, and I think he got the perfect kind of prep here. He didn't have an absolutely perfect trip. I mean, there was a little bit of trouble, a bit of a skirmish into that clubhouse turn when Flavien Prat was sort of deciding whether or not to go forward or take back because the horse inside of him, Law Professor, got a little bit rank, but ultimately settled into a good trip. And once he got this horse out into the clear, he was finishing showing a lot more stamina than anybody else in this race. So I thought it was a nice effort from him. I don't have a whole lot to say about those that were in behind. I mean, Charge It, I guess, was the big disappointment in this race, if there was one, but how disappointed can you be when Charge It keeps running these lackluster efforts over and over again when he faces really good horses? I mean, if things don't go perfectly for Charge It, he's just a horse that is not going to deliver.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, he wasn't, I think he was the 3rd choice in here. Even Tyson, the horse who had chipped in from Woodbine last time, took more money than him. So I don't even know how much of a disappointment he is, as bettors seem to expect it. The 2-3 finishers, they ran fine. I think All Professor, who ran a good 3rd, probably benefited from some moisture in the track, even though it was labeled as fast. It was definitely somewhat on the wet side, and when you look at his PPs, he's got a lot of good efforts on wet tracks. So I thought he ran good, but Film Star was able to hold him off. Took a big jump forward, speed figure wise, for that one for Linda Rice. So good effort there, but Zandon was still clearly much the best.
Now, the real star on this Sunday program was Cody's Wish, who went off as the heavy favorite and delivered a victory in the Grade 2 Vosburgh earlier in the day, going 7 furlongs. What do you make of this effort, Craig? Because, I mean, obviously, he was a heavy favorite on paper, and he won by a length and a half, which maybe seems a little conservative given his estimated advantage over this field just from a speed figure standpoint and what was expected from him in this race. Not that Accretive, who was second, is a bad horse, but I think you would have expected Cody's Wish to beat that rival pretty decisively. He broke slowly again. He did make a little bit of a premature move. It just feels like we haven't seen the dazzling effort that we saw out of him in the Met Mile in 2 subsequent starts, and Maybe that's just circumstances or by design in the case of this race, but I think there are some questions around Cody's Wish heading into the Breeders' Cup this year.
Yeah, definitely. I assume he's going to point towards the Breeders' Cup Hurt Mile again. Yeah, he's a horse who I'm not going to knock him too harshly on this race because the pace was just so slow. I mean, it was insanely slow. Creative went at 23 and something. The pace figure was only an 86, which for horses of this quality is just silly. So I think that kind of compressed the margins a bit. All the fractions are coded in blue. This race actually got a pace upgrade for the figure. The final time figure was a 112. Cody's Wish actually gets a 119. They all got 7-point boost because of how slow the pace was. So I'm really not sure what to make of this race. Unfortunately, it's all we're going to get before he shows up in the Breeders' Cup. But I totally understand people that have questions. I'm willing to forgive this one a little bit more just because of the pace and how I really think that kept the field a lot more compressed than it otherwise would have been.
Yeah, I'm guessing this race is supposed to have a P designation, Craig. I'm not seeing it in the chart, but that might be a that might be a glitch. I know we're changing the way we notate those where they go in the charts as we migrate to the new TimeformUS DRF. So I don't know if that's the case, but I was kind of assuming that when I looked at the speed figures for this day.
Yeah, I'm not sure why the P's not in the chart right now. It definitely should be. Anytime you see the speed figures higher on dirt than what the final time figures were, there was definitely a P upgrade, and it won't work without that P being in the system. So it's definitely a glitch somewhere. I'll have that get looked at today.
The other spread that they ran on the Sunday card at the Belmont at the Big A meet was the Grade 2 Gallant Bloom, this one for the fillies and mares, going 6.5 furlongs. And I mean, Craig, we can't talk about this race without discussing the controversial double disqualification. A double disqualification is something that you never want to see because, I mean, there's a lot of conjecture that's involved going into something like that, especially when both horses are disqualified for what the stewards deem to be the same incident. And I'm biased in this situation because I picked and I bet Sterling Silver in this race, and she won by 4 lengths, and she got disqualified and placed behind a horse that personally I didn't think was ever beating her. So that's going to be a frustrating situation for somebody like me. So maybe I should just hand it off to you.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm sick of talking about the stewards on the NYRA tracks. They're very inconsistent, in my opinion. I mean, most tracks, I won't say all stewards are great everywhere because they certainly are not. We see controversial decisions, but I would say 9 times out of 10, I know what the stewards are going to decide elsewhere, and that's just not the case on the NYRA circuit. And it can be very frustrating. I mean, I think it's clear Sterling Silver was the best horse in the field. Um, did she cost Caramel Swirl a position? I don't think it's clear cut. When I was watching the race live, I thought it was good riding by Javier Castellano, who just kind of beat Junior Alvarado to the spot and closed off that hole. Now, maybe it was unnecessary, and you could say it was kind of silly because I think his horse had all the momentum and was going to win the race anyway. But it was particularly perplexing to me because I didn't think Headland did very much, maybe came out just a little bit, and those two things together made it look a lot worse than it was. And if anything, I'd say the 4-horse Beguine, I think is how you say it, Beguine, was the one who suffered the most and was fouled and maybe cost a position, and that horse wasn't elevated. So I honestly have no idea what to expect anymore when the lights start blinking on the NYRA circuit.
Yeah, it's the worst situation when a decision like this is handed over to the stewards because I frankly have no faith in their ability to adjudicate these things fairly or even to apply their own rules. The stewarding in New York and the stewarding at a lot of tracks is a real problem. I'm somebody who supports a change to Category 1 rules. I was heartened to see Oklahoma make that change. Hopefully, other tracks or other jurisdictions see how well that worked, particularly in their premier race, the Oklahoma Derby, where in some jurisdictions, the winner of that race, how did he do that, might have been disqualified for a pretty inconsequential foul, if you want to call it that, at the top of the stretch for a horse that, maybe was cost a position off the board, but obviously that that horse was never beating, how did he do that? And the way that you adjudicate those in a Category 1 jurisdiction is you determine whether the horse that was fouled would have beaten the horse that fouled him. And obviously that was not the case, so it's not something the stewards could even look at. And it just results in fewer disqualifications, and it ties the hands of the stewards a little bit. And I think you want to see that because, Craig, I don't want stewards jumping into the conversation and basically just messing up the results of the race based on the opinions of three people who frankly I find I disagree with a lot about how races are run and what's actually impactful in terms of results of races. So it's the fewer decisions stewards have to make in terms of altering finishing positions, I think, is better for the sport.
I'm one who's come around a little bit on Category 1. I think both systems have their flaws personally, and I think good stewarding would help it if you stuck with Category 2. But it seems like to me the stewards, instead of using real deterrence with punishments of fines and suspensions, it seems like they just don't have the will to do that. And instead, they decide to punish riders by disqualifying them in actual races. And in that, when you do that, you're punishing the owners or punishing the bettors. And yeah, I've come around a bit where mostly because I don't trust the stewards. I think given the state of stewarding here in this country that I'd prefer Category 1 just because like you said, I don't have a lot of faith in them making the proper decisions.
Yeah, and some people might say, oh, these stewards are bad, just get different stewards. There are good stewards out there. I don't want to say that all stewards are bad stewards, but where are these great stewards that are being prevented from holding these roles? I don't think it's the most desirable position to have. I certainly wouldn't want to be a steward. And just changing the complexion of who is stewarding, which is harder to do than you might think, it doesn't solve the problem because these are human beings. They're flawed, and if you force them to make a lot of decisions about what the order of finish should be in races, the more decisions they make, the more mistakes that they're going to be, or the more opportunities that you have to disagree with them, or that the vast majority of the racing public might disagree with them, because there's a lot of subjectivity involved when you give them the power to just alter the results of races based on what they see, or conversations with jockeys, or potentially their own personal biases. So it's unfortunate, and I think it's the chorus that we often hear, Craig, is, well, would Sterling Silver have come down if maybe a different rider was on her back, or maybe if the leading rider was on her back? And it's something that I think people go to very often as a crutch, but in this situation, I think it's fair. I think we've seen a certain rider on the circuit commit that same foul a bunch of times and not get taken down. So obviously it's frustrating for me, but it's something that I'd like to see changed, and I don't have a whole lot of faith that there is any push to change it, especially not in New York State. But you just don't want to see a situation like that where a horse wins by 4 lengths and then the bettors get penalized who bet that horse. And I thought the winning rider, Javier Castellano, said it perfectly. He's in his quote in our daily racing form colleague Dave Gredding's piece following this race. Javier said, "Please punish me. You should give me days of a fine, but don't punish the bettors. Don't punish my owners and my trainer for something that they deem that I did." And Javier, I completely agree with that.
Yep, and it gets back to what I said, where the stewards just don't seem to have the will to do that. They punish via disqualification rather than fines and days. And I think it leads to a lot of this riding that we see on the NYRA circuit because they don't do these things. They're not proactive in preventing what could be considered rough or dangerous riding. And then when it does occur, it's nobody knows what's going to happen. So that's about all I have to say on it. I will talk a little bit about the race. Sterling Silver ran a 1:14 TimeformUS speed figure, much the best in the field, but I don't really see any of these horses being Breeders' Cup contenders at all.
No, I would agree with that. I don't think we've even mentioned the winner of the race, the official winner of the race, Caramel Swirl, aside from, in the context of her having some trouble. It was not a great trip for her. She was inside early. The rail post position dictated that, and she did have trouble in the race and was obviously cut off in mid-stretch. Who you want to blame it for, we won't rehash that. But obviously she was cost some position. How many positions, I think, is debatable. But even saying that, she was soundly defeated by Echo Zulu and Goodnight Olive in the Ballerina when we might have seen the best version of her. And was this race evidence that she's going to improve enough to beat either of those horses in the Breeders' Cup? Personally, I don't think so. They will proceed on to the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint with Caramel Swirl. I've yet to hear about Sterling Silver, though. I thought Sterling Silver, she ran a great race. The pace was slow. She looped the field on the outside, and she was absolutely flying through the final eighth of a mile of this race. We'll see. It remains to, we'll never know, I should say, if Caramel Swirl would have been able to go with her through that basically 6-second flat final 16th. But she ran really well. It's just that Sterling Silver, another horse that was soundly defeated in the Ballerina, and the Ballerina feels like it was the race that's the real preview of what's to come in the Breeders' Cup. So those two would have to improve quite a bit to be competitive in that championship event. And then we'll close things out at Aqueduct with one more race from this past week. The only other race day that they ran was on Thursday, where they were off the turf in this maiden special weight event in the middle of the card. Originally supposed to be 1 mile and 16th on the turf. They ran it the one-turn mile on the dirt. And Craig, that a horse that might not be seeing the turf anytime soon again is the winner, Moonlight, who did debut on the grass for trainer Todd Pletcher, beaten by Carson's Run that day. A very good horse who was subsequently won a Grade 1 race, but the switch over to the dirt seemed to really agree with this guy.
Yeah, it certainly did, to the tune of a 108 TimeformUS speed figure. He did it winning by 8 lengths, sat right up off of what was a pretty tepid pace, but pretty good horse in second choice Stolen Magic, who was an main track only horse in this race and ran a good race as well. But Moonlight was just much the best. And his breeding was, I guess it's fine for dirt. It seems like he ran well on turf, so they have some options with this one, but hard to imagine he wouldn't stay on the dirt after this performance.
Yeah, he really does have more of a dirt pedigree. I guess he had trained well or trained like a turf horse. I think he's by Audible. I've noticed they've run a lot of the Audibles on the turf so far, so maybe just the way his horses move is leading connections to run them on the turf. But this one obviously appreciated getting on the main track. I don't know what was behind him, Craig, because this was a race that was carded for the turf. There were no MTOs in here. They were all intended for the grass. So it feels like he beat up on a lot of turf-intended horses, but he won so decisively. And the other note I'll make about this day is that it did feel like on Thursday at Aqueduct, speed did really well. Not that there was a significant bias where you couldn't pass horses, but it just seemed like horses that were able to stay in the clear, not have to deal with kickback, be forward, generally had an edge in these races. We did see some big margins at the end of a few of them, so just something to keep in mind, but clearly this is a horse that has shown some talent. Let's move on to Churchill Downs to wrap up the podcast with a few races from there, primarily their Saturday card, where they ran a trio of stakes events, including the Grade 2 Lucas Classic, which I guess is sort of a prep for the Breeders' Cup Classic, though I don't know if any of these horses will ultimately go on to that race. The winner, Clapton Craig, felt like a horse that took advantage of circumstances because he caught the right field, and also he got the right kind of pace scenario to be successful.
He did. He was a horse who the fractions were fast. He came from well off the pace. The half miles coded in red in TimeformUS. And he basically run his race like he's done several times in a row and got a favorable pace set up. He wound up with a 118 TimeformUS speed figure. So good effort, but nothing I'm going to get too excited about Breeders' Cup wise.
Yeah, the horse that I think might have run the best race in this Lucas Classic is the runner-up Trademark, who was in pretty close attendance to that honest early pace and was the one that made the first move after the leaders at the top of the stretch and got to a clear lead at the 8th pole and just barely got run down at the very end. But another good effort from a horse who has run some big speed figures in the past. It's just the Breeders' Cup Classic is going to be a tough race for all of these horses. I think a more realistic goal, or this race might more realistically be a prep for a race like the Clark at the end of the season, especially for a horse like Trademark.
It could be. I mean, this is a horse Nick's Go won, so I mean, it has been used for success in the Breeders' Cup in the past, but it's just a little hard to see this year. Even if they were to cut back to a race like the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile, they're probably going to run into some better horses than what we see here. It's just one we got to see what the entries are. I guess the real disappointment here would be Rattle and Roll, a horse who was in really top form earlier in the year, had a few graded stakes wins, a narrow loss in one of his races where he ran a big speed figure, but his last two have been pretty ugly, and it seems like he's definitely tailed off.
Yeah, it can be a tough game sometimes to keep these horses going. I mean, I think about Ken McPeak, who came into this season with a trio of 4-year-olds that look like they could be major players in this division. Obviously Rattle and Roll, Smile Happy was the one that I think most people were excited about, and I guess you could even include Classic Causeway in that, even though they didn't really run him in any races on the dirt any point and took him over to Europe. Maybe there was a little mismanagement with a few of these horses, but they've all gone wrong, and it can happen. These thoroughbreds, they can go in and out of form. I mean, another one that was a disappointment in this race was American Revolution. I can't wrap my head around how he was 2-1 in this race off his pretty ugly return at Saratoga. But the bettors bet him on some of that back class, and it just didn't show up here. He did get an overly aggressive ride, and maybe was too close to that fast pace, but he really fell apart towards the end.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot to say. He just doesn't appear to be the same horse. I mean, it doesn't seem that long ago, although I guess it was now that he was winning the Cigar Mile and looked like the future was very bright for this one. And turns out that was his last win, and it's coming up on, I believe, 2 years since then. So, yeah, like you said, it's hard sometimes to keep these horses together, even when they're really talented.
The Grade 3 Aqueduct was run just before that, this one going the one-turn mile on the dirt at Churchill, and this is supposedly a prep for the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile for the winner Zozos, who I think is pointing to that race. I don't have a whole lot to say about this horse or this race, Greg. I don't think we learned a whole lot here. He got to the front end as the heavy favorite, sets a slow pace, and was able to hold on at the end. He didn't do anything exceptional. He didn't do anything to make me necessarily knock him. It was just sort of a race to, I think, get to the next one.
Yeah, I don't get some of these riders. And I know on our Timeform US pace projector that he was predicted to have a big early lead. But that doesn't mean when the gate opens, you actually just have to cede the lead to him. I mean, the fractions were insanely slow for this race. The first quarter mile pace figure was a 78, which is like maiden 15 claiming horses. I just don't get it sometimes. Zozos ran fine. His final time figure's a 119, but because of the pace, it's knocked all the way down to a 111. And it just seemed like this was a paid workout for him and basically all the other horses too, because nobody really tried to do anything until the stretch.
Yeah, it was just kind of a merry-go-round. I mean, 3 Technique passed a few horses. I mean, a game effort from him off a brief freshening. But, I mean, none of these horses, as you said, are going to get particularly eye-catching speed figures for a race that featured as slow a pace as this one. And, I guess Zozos is going to go on to the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile, but I know for sure he's going to experience a much more taxing pace scenario in that race because we typically see some pace develop in that dirt mile, especially when it's run around 2 turns.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned 3 Technique because he'd be the one I'd want out of this. He's a horse who's actually run some decent speed figures, overcoming slow paces in the past. It was a little too much to ask off the layoff this time. Just got to kind of see who shows up for that race and what kind of speed figures it's going to take to win, but I would consider him even more dangerous than the winner.
Now, it wasn't a graded stakes, but the stakes that earned the biggest speed figure of these 3 at Churchill on Saturday was the Jefferson Cup, which was won by the 3-year-old More Than Looks, going a mile on the turf. And Craig, this horse has gotten pretty good, and when he gets pace to close into, he's got some late kick on him.
Yeah, he's very good as he showed here. He wound up with a 122 Timeform US speed figure. He had plenty of pace to close into here as some of the fractions were coded in red. And not only that, it was a little heated early in the race as a couple horses went at it. And Gaslight Dancer kind of ran off from there and was setting 140 type pace figures. But More Than Looks, it's not like they just handed him the race. I mean, there were other horses benefiting from that pace as well. 3 of the top 4 finishers were well back. And he was just clearly way the best out finishing all of those, winning by almost 3 lengths. So yeah, really nice effort from him. And there were plenty of turf races on this card, so the speed figure wasn't particularly hard to make. And I mean, we've talked about the 3-year-old turf horses all year. He was one of them. He's been good. He wasn't able to handle Carl Spackler last time, but that one's very good as well. So it continues to be a division that's just way stronger than we usually see.
Yeah, and moving on to the Breeders' Cup, I mean, I haven't seen any reporting about whether they're going to point more than looks to a race like the Breeders' Cup Mile on the turf, but I mean, it does feel like among the American horses, the 3-year-olds might have the edge. I mean, you mentioned Carl Spackler, who beat more than looks in his prior race at Saratoga. I mean, he certainly run some speed figures that make him about just as good as the older horses, and I think Chad Brown is actually pointing him to the Grade 1 at Keeneland, the turf mile that was run towards the start of their meet. So maybe we'll see a little bit more of a clue about how those 3-year-olds stack up against the olders, but it certainly feels like the right kind of year for a 3-year-old to at least tackle the American older horses. We'll see what Europeans come over that could make these really tough races, but more than looks just seems like he's ascending with each start. And I mean, he did not get a great trip in that race where he was beaten by Carl Spackler in August at Saratoga. His prior race where he got plenty of pace to close into again, we saw that huge late run from him winning that race. And it just feels like a horse that gave him some pace, and he is going to come running with a big late move. Close out the action from Churchill Downs and this past weekend on the podcast with a maiden race from Sunday in Louisville, Kentucky. That was won by the 2-year-old Stronghold. This horse had run well on debut at Ellis Park, beaten by the promising Brad Cox runner Awesome Road. Came back for his second start here, going the mile and able to get the job done.
Yeah, he did. Phil D'Amato sent a nice one. Looks like he's running a string in Kentucky. I had run a 105 speed figure last time out, and it's a 103 for this win. So maybe a little bit of regression, but I don't really take that. I take that with a bit of a grain of salt because these two-year-old figures are always a little tough. I liked how he did it. I mean, he didn't save a lot of ground. He was pretty wide going into the turn. It's not like he was on the lead. He was able to rate and come from off the pace. So good, solid professional effort who seems like he didn't mind the extra ground at all.
Yeah, I think the performance that interests me more from this race is that of the runner-up, Resilience, who, not because of the race he ran here per se, I mean, he finished a fine second, but just the improvement that Resilience showed from his first start to the second start. And you'll note that on debut, he was coming out of that maiden race at Saratoga, won by Locked, who I think was a winner by over 7 lengths, and then beat the runner-up, beat the rest of the field by 13 lengths. It got a huge speed figure for a 2-year-old, especially at that stage of the year. So the fact that Resilience was able to take such a huge step forward out of that race won by Locked, I think is a good sign for that horse. I believe we're going to see Locked next in the Breeders' Futurity at Keeneland. The runner-up from that race, drumroll please, that was supposed to run this past weekend at Aqueduct on a day that was canceled. That race has been rescheduled for Friday, and drumroll please was re-entered. So I think we'll get some more clues about how strong that Locked maiden race really was. But Resilience certainly hinting that that was a race that might be every bit as good as it looked at the time.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, he improved his speed figure by 20 points to a 99. He's the only one to run back, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see some others who take big steps forward.
Well, Craig, we expected to see a little more stakes racing than we got this week, but I think the Breeders' Cup preps are going to continue coming out as fast and furious over the next few weeks. We have stakes action scheduled through the midweek in New York, and then obviously a ton of stakes on Saturday. There'll be a lot when Keeneland gets up and going, so I think we're going to see a lot of these Breeders' Cup pictures become clearer over the next week and a half or so.
Yeah, no doubt. We're not going to see much after this week as we're getting a little too close to the Breeders' Cup, but still plenty of action to come. I'm sure we'll see several Breeders' Cup entrants running this next weekend.
Well, everybody, thanks for tuning in to our recap of last week's racing on this Pacecast. Craig and I will, of course, be back for the TimeformUS forecast a little bit later in the week. We'll wait to see which track we're going to take a look at, Keeneland or Aqueduct. We'll see how some of those cards come up. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify, as well as YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Everybody, again, thanks for listening to the Pacecast this week, and make sure to catch the TimeformUS forecast coming up on Friday.